for you all. Thank you so much for the music. So grateful for you all that we are on this journey together to more life and deeper life, to a deeper quality of life that we receive through this walk with Jesus Christ. I'm thankful for our women who are away on retreat today, and particularly for the woman in my life who I've been married to for 18 years today. So it is our anniversary. There she is. Hi, Yvette. I love you. Happy anniversary. This winter, we are doing a series on the fears that we live with. The fears that are always right there, just simmering under the surface. The fears that hamstring us and box us in. The fears that manipulate us and paralyze us in this age of anxiety that you and I are living in. And so on this day, on this Martin Luther King weekend, I want to talk about a fear that is particularly common and insidious in our lives and our world right now. It is a fear that affects every community, every nation, really every continent around the world. And that is the fear of the other, the fear of the stranger. It is one of Yvette and my greatest fears, not just that something might happen to one of our children, but that something could happen as a result of a stranger. Every time we hear that Amber Alert go off on our phones, it is unlike any other alarm in our lives. It has the ability to make our hands sweat and the hairs stand up on the back of our necks. It is the most visceral and guttural fear that there is. I don't know, it may be that times have changed, maybe, or perhaps it's just our excuse, but when I was a kid, we used to traipse all over the town that I grew up in, on foot, on bikes, me and my friends. Didn't matter, our moms didn't care as long as we were in before dark or in before 10 p.m. on summer nights. And yet now, in contrast, I don't think Ryan or Clay, who are 10 and 12 years old, have ever even set foot outside of the front door of our house unless they've been accompanied by one or the other of us. Never mind the fact that there are 70 million children in this country, and only about 100 go missing every year because of a stranger. That is about 1 in 700,000, by the way. Or it doesn't matter that of those 100 that go missing, it's 90-something% that end up finding their way back home safe and sound. Never mind the fact that it's more likely that you're going to be struck by lightning twice than have a child abducted. Much more likely that you'll have a coconut fall on your head or be attacked by a great white shark in fresh water. Maybe be struck by lightning while you're being attacked by a great white shark in fresh water. The researchers and the scientists have questioned this, why it is that we have this almost innate tendency to fear the other, to be fearful of the stranger, why it is that we tend to group ourselves off into groups and then have a preference for those groups. There was a study that was done a few years ago at a preschool where they took a couple of classes of preschool children and they completely randomly divided them into two. They gave one group a set of blue t-shirts to wear as a uniform, another set of red t-shirts. They told the teachers not to mention the t-shirts, say anything about the t-shirts, or to treat the kids any differently as a result of the t-shirts. And yet what they found is that within a few weeks, the kids started treating each other distinctly different based on whether they wore red or blue t-shirts. At the end of the study, they did a survey, and they asked, who do you think is smarter amongst the kids, the blue or the red t-shirts? And of course, those who wore blue t-shirts said, those red kids, they're pretty smart, but the kids who wear the blue t-shirts, they're a little bit smarter. They asked, which do you think are nicer? Which do you think are faster runners? And of course, the Reds said that, I think that the red t-shirts are a little bit nicer. The red t-shirts run just a little bit faster than those in the blue t-shirts. A friend of mine who I used to work with in Croatia, Miroslav Volf, the theologian, he really took some time to try to dissect and explore this phenomenon. And what he discovered as he was trying to figure out the heartbreak after the Balkan War was that this tendency of ours, this almost genetic, almost evolutionary, if you believe in that stuff, tendency of ours towards grouping ourselves off is as a result of our deep insecurities. That he said it has to do with our problem with what he called identity and otherness. He said that it's not just about our safety and our protection. But what he said is that from the time we are born, we are all in a lifetime quest to try to figure out our sense of identity, to try to figure out where we belong. Who am I? Where do I fit in? What is my place in this huge and often overwhelming world that we live in? And he said that as a result, it is important for us to find our identity in little subgroups. And we will create these groups around pretty much anything. Around the nation we live in, the culture we belong to, around our sex, around our religion. We will create this around our political affiliations, around the universities we go to, even around the cars that we drive or the blue jeans that we wear. That we are always creating these groups where we can feel that we have a sense of belonging, where we feel like we have a sense of identity, where we can feel like we actually matter. And of course, what he was saying is that in order to have this group where we belong, it's also incumbent that we have others who are not a part of the group, who are on the outside, those who don't fit in. This is what he's talking about when he says it's a matter of identity and otherness. And of course, when you add a little bit of power to these insecurities that we all have deep down inside, then suddenly laws begin to be passed and walls begin to be built and executive orders begin to be decreed. That relegate some, they label and relegate some to the back of the bus or squeeze them out of our schools or say that certain nations or ethnicities or religions are no longer welcome in our country. We start to systematically create very, very sophisticated forms of self-protection in our racism, in our nationalism, in our classism, in our elitism, and our sexism. All as ways to try to protect ourselves during scary and vulnerable times when we feel a little out of control or otherwise unprotected. And I don't want to say that this is a jab at national security, because I think we all agree that we need a sane, normal, thoughtful, wise approach to borders and border protection and security. Nations should have the right to build a wall if they want one and if they need one, but I think we all understand that there is something deeper going on right now in our world. That right now, as our world just gets smaller and smaller, as we become more interwoven and more deeply interconnected, that it's not just our safety and our security that's at risk, is it? This has to do about more than that. This has to do about our very sense of identity and belonging. We see it right now. It's startling in our own country. The rise in these hate crimes we see all around us. Proliferation of more and more nationalist groups and white supremacist groups. It is the very denial, it is It is the very pushback against one of the most natural truths that we were been created with, that we are all one. That in a very real sense, we belong to each other, that we are all part of the same human family. The scientists show us that more than 99.9% of all of our DNA we hold in common with every other human being across this entire planet. This is who we are. We are interconnected in an inseparable bundle of life. And that when one of us is hurt, all of us are hurt. And in a very real sense, when one person is set free, then all of us are set free. So what does the Bible have to say about this? Fortunately, it has to say a lot. And unlike many of the other controversial issues that we get into in our society, this one is pretty straightforward and clear, from one end of the Bible to the other. Sure, the Bible talks about security. Nehemiah went back to Jerusalem to rebuild the walls. There was a need for safety and security in those days, but God was very, very clear from the very beginning, from one end of that book to the other, that we are to love the other, that we are to welcome and protect the stranger and the foreigner in our midst. One of the passages, one of many, comes from Deuteronomy. Listen now to the word of God. And now, Israel, what does the Lord your God ask of you? But to fear, there's that word, interesting, isn't it? Fear the Lord your God, to walk in obedience to him, to love him, to serve the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul, and to observe the Lord's commands and decrees that I am giving you today for your own good. To the Lord your God belongs the heavens, even the highest heavens, the earth, and everything, might I also say, everyone in it. Yet the Lord set his affection on your ancestors and loved them, and he chose you. He chose you, their descendants, above all of the nations as it is today. Therefore, circumcise your hearts. Do not be stiff-necked any longer. For the Lord your God is the God of gods and the Lord of lords, the great God, mighty and awesome, who shows no partiality and accepts no bribes. He defends the cause of the fatherless and the widow, and loves the foreigner residing among you, giving them food and clothing. And you are to love those who are foreigners, for you yourselves were foreigners in Egypt. Fear the Lord your God and serve him. Hold fast to him and take your oaths in his name. He is the one you praise. He is your God who performed for you those great and awesome wonders you saw with your own eyes. Your ancestors who went down into Egypt were 70 in all. And now the Lord your God has made you as numerous as the stars in the sky. This is the word of the Lord. Again, from one end to the other, from Genesis to Revelation, the story is the same over and over again. This message is simple. God says, first, remember who you are. Each one of you has a history. Each one of you has a story. We all know what it feels like to be rejected and to be left on the outside, to have someone make us feel like we don't matter and we don't count and we don't belong. We all have a story. This Christmas, Yvette and I gave each other 23andMe DNA kits for Christmas. We haven't gotten them back yet, but we're sort of waiting on pins and needles. I love all these stories where you hear about white supremacists or people who are in nationalist groups who get back their 23andMe and see that they have African American in their ancestry or Judaism in their ancestry. I think it would kind of change everything if everybody had to take one of those tests and just wear them around on their chests all day. We all have a story. God says, You were slaves in Egypt. You are the ones on the outside. Remember who you are. Remember your history. And then he says, if you want someone to fear, fear me. Don't fear those who might take away your physical safety or your economic safety. Worry about your soul. If you want to be scared of me. Be loyal to me. You need someone to be loyal to? You be loyal to God. Serve the Lord your God. And do what I command. Love the other. Welcome the stranger. Be kind to those who are foreigners in your midst. Tomorrow, this country is going to shut down so that we can celebrate the life and the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr., a man who seared the conscience of an entire generation and all of those generations to follow, a man who 57 years ago stood on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial on the Mall of Washington, D.C., and said, I have a dream. A dream that one day my 2 little boys and my 2 little girls will not be judged for the color of their skin, but for the content of their character. Martin Luther King Jr. would be the first to tell you that his success, the reason that he's captured the imagination of so many people, not just Christians, not just Americans, but people of every stripe all over the world, isn't because of his incredible talent, though he was incredibly talented. It isn't because of his command of the English language or his incredible oratorical skills. It was because he allowed himself to fall madly in love with the God who created him and loves him and knows him. That he was willing to read this book, this Bible, and to take it seriously. The problem with putting Martin Luther King on too much of a pedestal, to sort of see him as some kind of demagogue with superhuman powers, is then we abdicate our own responsibility, our own opportunity to pick up the mantle where MLK left off and to do the things that MLK did. He would be the first to tell us that this stuff is not rocket science. This is the simple, straightforward commands of the Bible from one end to the other, to allow God to love us so that we are able to love everybody that God has created. And that would be, oh yeah, everybody across this planet. One of the incredible gifts that God gives us when we become children of God, when we allow ourselves to be received into God's embrace, we allow ourselves to be loved by God and claimed by God, is that we are given a new sense of identity. We are given an incredible sense of belonging, and for the first time in our lives, we never have to question it again. We belong to God, and by that, we belong to every other person across this planet. No longer do we have to create these false senses of security, these false senses of identity and belonging that we hide behind, because we know that we belong, and we know that everyone else does too, as part of the human family. You all remember who Peter Arnett was, the famous CNN news reporter? He tells a story about a time when he was on the West Bank, and there all of a sudden this big explosion ripped through the street that he was on. It knocked him to the ground, and his head was ringing, and all he saw was bodies flying everywhere. And by the time he sort of came to and got back up on his feet, all he saw around him was death and destruction. As the fog was clearing, he saw this man running straight at him with this small little girl in his arms who was covered in blood. And he said, "Please, sir, please, we've got to get her to the hospital. The troops have sealed off this area, but you're a reporter. You can get through the blockade. We've got to get this girl to the hospital or she is going to die. Please, you must." And so Peter reacted, and he got this man and the little girl in his arms into the back seat, and he started driving, and they got to the blockade, and they made it through the blockade because he was part of CNN, and they started racing to get to the hospital. And the whole time this man was wailing and crying and praying out loud. He was urging Peter. He said, "Faster, faster, you must go faster. I'm losing her. I'm losing her." And they got to the hospital, and they took her into the surgery, and Peter and this man sat in the waiting room, and they were so exhausted and so numb that they just sat there silently, not saying a word to each other. After about an hour or more, the surgeon came into the waiting room, and he came up to the two men and he said, "I am so sorry, there was nothing we could do. She didn't make it." And the man next to Peter just started to wail and to cry. And Peter didn't know what to say, and he tried to comfort this man. He tried to put his arm around her. He said, I can't even imagine what you're going through. I have no idea what it would be like to lose a child." And all of a sudden, the man was kind of startled and shook, and he sat up and he said, "Oh, mister, she's not my child. This is not my daughter, but at some point, we have to realize they are all our children. I am an Israeli settler. She's a Palestinian girl, but at some point, we need to understand that all of these children are our children. That at the end of the day, we are all part of one family." This is what Martin Luther King understood. It's not rocket science. It is the most basic truth that God plasters from one end of the Bible all the way to the other. That we are one. That we are all bound up together in one intricate bundle of life. That when one of us is hurt, we are all hurt. When one of us is freed, we are all freed. Martin Luther King understood that he was drawn into a family and belonged as part of the family of God. And it gave him a new identity and a sense of belonging that allowed him to dare to believe that everybody else was welcomed as well. As we come into this new year, as we go through this series about the fears that underlie our lives, I hope you will challenge yourself to spend some time asking yourself, what are the walls that I have created around my life and around my heart to keep others out? What are the blinders that I've put on so I don't have to see the pain and the suffering around me? Maybe the people who are living on the streets in LA right in our own backyard, the immigrants who wash our cars and work in our yards, who are trying to save enough money to send back to their families in the countries that they come from. This is not just about racism and nationalism, but all of the walls that we build between denominations and theologies, between classes and political views. And then when you've identified those walls, I challenge you to open your heart this year to allow God to love you, to allow God to give you a fresh start, to allow God to give you a new identity and a new sense of belonging as a child of the living God. Because as you do, you will have such a sense of who you are. You will have such a sense of how much you matter, of how much you belong, that all of the other walls in your life will start to come down brick by brick. And then we, just like Martin Luther King, will be able to say, "Free at last, free at last. Thank God Almighty, I am free at last." Amen.